part of the community are the churches. When the Cedar Grove community was originally being established and founded in around the late 1890s, we started out with 5 different churches. We started out with Philippi Baptist. We started out with Brown's Chapel A&E Zion. We started out with my home church, St. Paul A&E Zion, which is now United Methodist. There was also a church called St. Mark's Church. There was another church that was on the corner called the Community Church. So here we are in this very tight, small knit community. And we have five churches, and they were large churches. And I didn't think that there was that many people within the Cedar Grove community, but when I decided to take the time to go and look through all the census information from like the 1870s and the 1860s on, I had no idea the number of people that actually resided in the Cedar Grove community. Another one of the structures that was original to the Cedar Grove community, and going back to our churches, was a church called St. Mark's Church. This was a holiness church. This was a peace church. That church was another facility that no one talked about. No one really understood the importance. No one understood that it needed to be saved. Just like the 1905 log cabin that got torn down by the city, that church too needed to be saved. But around 2000, I think, maybe 2001, it was finally demolished. And it was before I had a chance to really make my voice known and do anything about it. It was kind of like one day I went to work and the building was all gone. The only thing left were the steps to the church, and I was thinking, how quick could someone have made a decision on that? And the church was beautiful. It was red. It had the red stained glass. So everything inside of this church, the pews, the hymnal books, the offering plates, everything that was in this particular church was torn down and carried off. No one saved or thought anything about saving one single piece of that memorabilia out of that particular church. And we had another church that was just destroyed. This one was original. This church too was, the community church was actually a part of the Cedar Grove community, which means right now where the Elizabethton Board of Education is, where their building is sitting, the community church was right there on the corner. That was another church that was demolished. And everything inside of it was actually just towed off and taken away. So the Cedar Grove community has such a rich history. That's why I find it so important to do what we do as a part of the Cedar Grove Foundation. I love to collect history. I love to preserve it. I love to share it. I love to educate. I love to tell people when they look at a blank or an empty parking lot, or they see a field that's empty, I love to tell them, you would not believe what used to be there. But I love it even more when I can pull out a photo and say, I actually got this from the lady next door that when she passed away, she was like 110 years old and she gave me this photo. So this was actually over there. It's not there now, but this is the history that we have. So the Cedar Grove community has a lot of rich history. Going back to another one of the original structures that was part of the Cedar Grove community in the late 1890s, there was another log cabin structure. This structure, once again, was probably directly across the street from where the Elizabethton Blues baseball team is now, the field is. So let's say that you're standing by, if you're standing by the Elizabethton Blues Tennessee State Historical Marker, and you look directly across the street, to your right was another little log cabin house that was built in the late 1890s, okay? This particular log cabin was built the same time that the Knights of the Diocese log cabin was built. I think that log cabin is so special. I remember that log cabin because even as a little girl, that log cabin was still standing when I was in junior high. By the time that I was in high school, it was actually demolished and actually taken away. That little house was so amazing. I find it amazing because one of the Elizabethton Blues baseball players, his name was Pat McGee. He actually lived in that facility for a while with his dog. So not only was that log cabin a very important piece of the community, of the Cedar Grove community, and a part of its original beginnings, you actually had an Elizabethton Blues player that actually lived in the house. And if you're not familiar with who the Elizabethton Blues are, they are the Tri-Cities only barnstorming, semi-professional Negro baseball league. This is the only one that we have in our area. And they were young men that came from all over the area. They came from Elizabethton, they came from Johnson City, they came from Kingsport, they came from Greenville, they came from Middle Tennessee, they even came from Virginia and also Kentucky. And we'll actually talk a little bit more about the Elizabethton Bluegrays here in just a moment. Getting back to some of the original origins of the Cedar Grove community, right now where the Tennessee Historical Marker stands for the Elizabethton Bluegrays, once again, if you're standing by that marker and you're looking at the field, that field was the original meeting place for the African American Knights of Matthias. That's the original field that they used to meet in before the trees were cut down. So the difference between the field looking the way it was when the Elizabethton Bluegrays players were playing and the way that the Knights of Matthias saw it was they were able to go in through all of these thick cedar trees, meet, conduct their business, select officers, do whatever they needed to do, and come back out. So after the Knights of Matthias, later on down the road, it was between the late 1890s and probably the early 1900s, the Knights of Matthias actually garnered enough money to build that small little log cabin house that was actually directly across the home from where my mom used to live, right? So once they actually moved on to Southland Avenue, that's when the trees were actually cut down. So when they actually cut down the cedar trees, that's when the Elizabethton Bluegrays players actually came into play. And what a lot of people don't understand is there's actually, and I haven't talked a lot about this, I think I've mentioned it a couple of times, we actually have two sets of Elizabethton Bluegrays players, okay? We have the original set that were actually Civil War participants. These guys were part of the 1st United States Colored Heavy Artillery, and they were also members of the Knights of Matthias. So these guys were like the first guys who actually called themselves the Elizabethton Bluegrays. So once we actually found this out, and we found this out from interviewing a neighbor of mine. I think she's like 103 or 4 when she passed away, because her husband was part of the Masons. So we also had African American Masons in Elizabethton. But this field was actually so important to the community. But anyway, the original players of the Bluegrays were Civil War participants. They were also descendants of the enslaved, and they were also freedmen. So you had this first set that was playing. When the second set of Elizabethton Bluegrays players came along, it was 1935. So some of these kids that were playing in 1935 knew or either were descended from or related to the original set. So when we went about collecting history, this is how we found out that there were two different sets. But everyone on the team were either like related, they were descended from, or they knew of in some way, shape, or form. Some other things that were going on in Cedar Grove community at this time. Douglas School proved to be pretty interesting. A lot of people probably don't know this either. We all read about the colored school in Elizabeth, right? We always read about Douglas School. We always read about that Douglas School was started in around 1890 or so. Douglas School got its start on a place called Cat Island in Elizabethton. And as everyone knows, there was that great flood in 1901 that kind of wiped the school outhouses and everything else. So the Douglas School, and it wasn't called the Douglas School at that time, it was called the Colored School. So the Colored School at that time had to have a place to go. So the Colored School was relocated from after that big flood in 1901 to St. Paul A&E Zion Church. I had to think about that because the name of my church actually changed. At the time it was known as St. Paul A&E Zion Church, so Reverend Breedlove was actually the teacher there. So the church opened their doors and allowed the school to come in and share the facilities and teach until a new school was actually built. Once that new school was built and there was city involvement, one of the teachers actually suggested that the school be named Douglas. So that's how it actually got its name, was Douglas. But a lot of people don't realize that when that first school was actually built on that ground, there was already a small little wooden shack that was already there, and it wasn't even really a log cabin, because my mom and my grandmother and my aunt remembered growing up and actually being there. There was a small building in the far corner. Let's see. The Elizabethton Bluegrass field was here, okay? This is going to be the same area where they played and the Knights of Matthias actually met. Over here on the same piece of land, you had this school. This school was already there for colored people, as they would say, while the school was located on Cat Island. So whenever the Douglas School was beginning to be built on their land, they had a school to be torn down, and nobody really talks a lot about that pre-existing school. And I still have questions to this school. What was it called other than just the colored school? Because that school actually predates Douglas School. But no one has a lot of information on it. But I've interviewed so many elderly people within the community that either went to that school or they had family or uncles or so forth and so on that actually did go. So there was a school that actually predates the Douglas School. A couple other things I want to mention is my favorite thing to talk about is actually my Elizabethton Bluegrass. They are my guys. They are just absolutely my guys. One thing that we found out when we were actually, and this was over 15 years ago, when we first started collecting and preserving history, there is one thing that we wanted to do each home that we went into, and trust me, we had volunteers. We went through the community, we knocked on every single door, introduced ourselves, said who we were, what we were doing, what we were going to do with the information that they would give us if they would be willing to share, and take it from there. So as we were going door to door, and we definitely gained the community's trust. It's so important that when you're dealing with people's history, to have someone's trust. It's a little different within the African American history when you're going about collecting history and you're wanting to preserve it. You have to be very careful as to how you go in and approach families and people within the Black community. And you have to be mindful, because the first thing you want to be is you have to be respectful. You cannot go into a community and demand someone's history. I've actually had someone approach and do that to me, so I'm speaking from experience. You have to be very respectful. You have to introduce yourself. You have to, first of all, find out, is there anyone else in this community that's walking around going door to door doing what I'm doing? That's the first thing that we did. When we decided that we wanted to be a legitimate historical society, the first thing I did, I went door to door and I wanted to know, is there anyone else in this community doing what I'm about to do? Because if so, I don't want to be disrespectful. I don't want to step on anyone's toes. And if it is someone doing it, I want to go and learn from them and find out how they're doing what they're doing. So when I went door to door, and we did this for several months, so going door to door, I found out that we were the only ones that was doing this. And everyone was excited. Everyone was wanting to share photos, and we did so many interviews. We have so many interviews, audio interviews, that it's just amazing that we'll definitely have to share those with the public. So once we went through the community, and I found out that no one was doing what the Cedar Grove Foundation was doing, then all of us went back and we went knocking door to door, and we wanted to know, what did you do? Who is your family? What school did you attend? What kind of grades did you get? What was your favorite thing? So as I mentioned before, my favorite thing to talk about is really my Elizabethton Bluegrass. So we were on probably a year of interviewing people and going door to door. That's just how long it took us, because we were very mindful and very respectful about speaking with people. We would be invited in, and if someone offered you dinner, you had to sit down to dinner, because that's where they would talk to you. It wasn't you would come in and say, hi, I'm Jacey, Augustus, director of the Cedar Grove Foundation, and I'd like to collect your photos and get your history. That's not how that went. You would go in and introduce yourself, and the first thing would be, can I fix you a cup of coffee? Sure, I'd love a cup of coffee. We're about to have dinner, would you like to have dinner? Of course I would. That's where the conversations would start. That's where the trust would begin. And that's where the history would flow, the pictures would come out, the memories would come into play, and you would have such a major collection of information and history from the Cedar Grove community that was just simply amazing. I had no idea that I had all the history in my community that I had, because growing up, I grew up in a culture where, as a young person, if there's one thing that you did not do, you did not ingratiate yourself into, as we say, grown folks conversations, okay? If you were a young person and you were in a room with an adult, you did not enter into that conversation unless someone invited you in, or unless someone asked you a question, or if someone wanted to share something with you. Other than that, if grown folks were gathered somewhere, they were talking, you walked away with your friends and you kept going. So I just think about all the wonderful conversations that I missed out on because I was a young person. I do remember them talking about baseball, but I never heard them mention the name Bluegrass because as a young person, you're not allowed to stay with those adults and listen to them speak. And especially being a young girl, you have to, do what your mom says. You have to walk away and go play with your friends. But I would hear little bitty bits and pieces of history that people would talk about, and I was kind of interested, but because I was so young, I really wasn't that interested, so I didn't kind of like hang around or kind of sneak around to see what anyone was saying. And I so regret that. I wish I was one of those nosy kids that just like to interrupt and get involved with all of grown people's conversations. I think if I had, I would have had so much more history than I have now. But having said that, going door to door, we were at 1 year of interviewing people. We probably have in our collection, we probably have maybe 4,000 to 5,000 photographs relating to the community, to the Cedar Grove community. As far as audio recordings, we have interviewed the Bluegrass, we have interviewed people within the community, so we have a lot of audio recordings as well. But getting back to the year end, toward the year end of going from door to door and telling people who we are, what we do, and what we want, and what we want to do, what we want to collect, the big question came up. Now, what do you plan on doing with this once you get it? People always want to know that. So in 2007, we had pulled together so much information, photographs and audio recordings and just so much wonderful stuff that we were wanting to pull a book together. One of the individuals, one of our supporters that was going to help us pull together was Harrison Taylor. And he was actually one of the descendants of Bob and Al, governors of Tennessee. He was a supporter of ours from the very beginning. So we were going to pull a book together and get it out there about the community. And that's when everyone that was involved with the foundation, we all ended up being involved in a lot of life events. And when I say life events, I mean tragedies. A lot of us suffered a lot of sicknesses. A lot of us had to pull back and heal. A lot of us had to put a few things aside. So between 2007-8 and leading up to 2016, I actually had to step back from the foundation. I won't say that I wasn't doing anything. I was doing something. I was just quiet about it and very low key. Because I was in the background like all my other volunteers and everyone else. We were mending, we were healing, we were trying to pull our families and pull other things together. So the whole time when I'm behind the scenes doing this, I'm actually working on getting a Tennessee State historical marker for the Elizabeth Bluegrass. I was quiet. I wasn't out front, out in public like people are used to seeing me. I was just behind the scenes doing stuff. So I went into historical hibernation, so to speak, from 2008 until like 2016. And then when I came out, we actually did the Tennessee State historical marker. We actually dedicated the sign to the Bluegrass as well as to the field that they played on. So when I did come back out in 2016, I actually stepped back again and I let some of my volunteers go into the community and ask them, to partner with anyone that's wanting to do something with the Cedar Grove community or anything with our, with family history or community history. Partner up, just let me know what you're doing and we'll all talk about it and see what we need to do. So that's what a lot of people did. So between 2016 and probably January of 2021, Coach Presnell at Elizabeth High School kind of pulled me out of hibernation. I was still working behind the scenes. I was actually working on, once again, trying to pull a book together because there's so much history that I have to share this. How can I not share the information that we have this history because people need to know about it? I'm of the mindset that the first hero that you're going to find is going to be in your family. The second hero you're going to find is going to be in your community. So I'm just all about, lifting up and raising up community history. But anyway, I went back into hibernation trying to work on a book. And Coach Presnell brought me out. He actually had left a message on my Facebook. And this is how removed I was from doing anything historical in a sense. Our Facebook was up, but no one was doing anything with the Facebook. I mean, the Facebook was dormant. There were probably 656 messages that people had left over a long period of time, trying to get a hold of me, wanting to do things about the Bluegrass, wanting to know who they were, where they came from, and all this other information, but no one was responding because we had all kind of like stepped back for a while to kind of like just reflect. And once again, I had went back into quiet mode, but I was still working. I was still trying to work on a book. So Coach Prestel actually brought us out in 2021 because he was pretty excited about hearing about the Blue Grays. We actually have a display that's actually at the Elizabethton Library. We actually dedicated it to the last two remaining Blue Grays players, which was James Ciforni and Columbus Ted Hartzell. They were the last two remaining players, and we thought it would be wonderful if we could actually get their display in a school so everyone could actually know that they have history in their own backyard. And also, it's also a piece of Tennessee history. It's a piece of local history, but it's also state history too. So we actually took, we have one of their original gloves that's on display. It's very old, it's probably falling apart by now, but we actually have an original glove that's in the display at the Elizabethton High School. I believe we have an autographed baseball bat. We have a photo that's in there of the group. And we also have a jersey. Now the jersey that if you go to the Elizabethton High School and see the display, there is a jersey that's on display there. That jersey has history to it. When we were first going about and collecting information on the Elizabethton Blue Grays, we realized that they ended up having a tab at Brummett Sports Shop. Now Brummett Sports Shop, I think, came around in 1955, if I'm not mistaken. If anyone's watching, they can actually correct me, no big deal. Anderson actually had the sports shop before Brummett's bought it. So when it was still Anderson's, it was like the Blue Grays. They had their very own tab to where they could go and they could buy their jerseys, they could get their shoes, their socks, their bats, their gloves. And I had walked into the shop one day, and Glenn was working there. Glenn was the owner. And I showed him a picture and I told him the story, and I was like, you know that these guys had a tab here at the store? And I said, the uniforms that they're wearing now, these uniforms actually were purchased here at Brummett's. And he had this look on his face and he got really excited. He's like, I think I've got two from that same era upstairs in the attic. He's like, let me go look. So he went upstairs, he found two jerseys from the exact same era that the Elizabethton Blue Grays had their picture taken in. And one of the gray jerseys was actually the exact same color, had the same piping, the same style that they actually wore in 1940 and 1955. So we were lucky to have two of those jerseys that was actually just donated to us. So what we did, we took one of those original jerseys, we put that on display in the Elizabethton High School display case. And the second one is just one that I actually have in key. There was a time that I used to wear that jersey when I was maybe like 50 pounds smaller, but now I can't. But it is on display. It is on display next door at the Jonesboro Museum. So if anyone sees that uniform, that jersey, that is an original jersey that came from Brummett's. The pigeons had nested in it whenever he went up to get it, but it was cleaned and sanitized, and it is the real deal. The only thing that's new on the jersey is the new owners of Brummett's actually repaired the lettering on the front because the jersey is really old. The jersey is actually older than me, so it's so if you get a chance, please go over to the Jonesboro Museum and actually check out the display. But anyway, having those uniforms and that memorabilia in those displays was just wonderful. The thing that really made my day was when we dedicated the Elizabethton High School display, it was actually a secret. It was actually a surprise. We contacted the families of James Forney. We contacted the families of Columbus Hartzell. We told everyone in their family what we were doing, but we didn't tell them what we were doing. We were just, we went and invited them. Could you please, come out to Elizabethton High School? We're just going to have a little get together, and we just want you there. We just want you there. And it took a little pulling because neither of the old guys wanted to come out. So I was like, please, could you just please do this for me one time? So I got the families. I was like, I think I need some help. Everyone have to nudge them to get them down to the high school. So both families got the guys out, and when they got down there and we unveiled the display, the looks on their faces was priceless. Oh, it was just absolutely priceless. And the first thing they said that they didn't think that anybody cared enough about them to do anything like this. And I told them, you are a piece of history. I told them Jackie Robinson did not get where he got without Negro barnstorming baseball teams that came before him that set the path. I said, he's where he is because you all did what you did. So we were very, very excited to actually be able to honor them with that display. But getting back to how we actually wound up with some of the photographs of the Blue Grays, I had knocked on Mr. Forney's door, and I'd lived beside this man for my whole life. I had no idea the important role that he played in community history, or the fact that he played a role in national and Tennessee history. So I went next door and I told him, he was like the last person on my list. I said, Mr. Chick, that's what I called him. I said, Mr. Chick, I said, you already know what I'm doing. He's like, yes, I've heard all about you. He's like, well, come on in, because Doris is fixing dinner. That's just why. So I went into the dinner, and of course we had to eat a little something, had some coffee. So my first question to Chick Forney was, what did you do growing up for fun? And he always had this large chunk of tobacco in his jaw, right? He says, girl, I played baseball. I said, really? I said, really? And his wife said, we have pictures. I was like, let me see the pictures. And I looked at the pictures, and as soon as I saw the photos, I was like, oh my goodness, you are part of the Negro Legacy. that was my immediate response. So one picture came out, 2 photographs came out, 3 photographs came out, and more, and that's when we actually went out on the porch, took my coffee outside, had some cake. So we're out there, I'm having cake and having coffee, and Mr. Forney's like, he has his tobacco, and his wife Doris is there, and he begins telling the story as to how he actually begins to play with the Elizabeth the Blue Grays. Chick Forney was one of the younger guys he started playing with that first generation of Elizabeth the Blue Grays players. He was like a little boy, and he said he would sneak off from his chores. He said he would get in trouble with his dad. He would get a whipping, he said. But he would sneak off from his chores when they would be playing down in that field that the Knights of Matthias used to play in. He would sneak off and he would go down there and play catch with the older guys, and when he got older, he ended up being a part of the second generation of Elizabeth the Blue Grays. So that's how he got started. So with the second generation of Elizabeth the Blue Grays, most of them are either related to the first, they're either descendants of in some way, shape, or form, or they were related to the Civil War participants who were part of the original ones, or their families were part of the Knights of Matthias. So there is a lot of rich history between the first generation of Blue Grays players and also the second generation of Blue Grays players. Something I find interesting too, a lot of their games, and of course we are dealing with segregation during this time, right? 1935, 1955. We are dealing with Jim Crow laws, right? We are dealing with all kinds of things, but you have these young African American men who are traveling in the South from state to state, and it's very dangerous for them to do this at this time. Even though they're playing baseball, they're doing this in dangerous times. But Mr. Forney had told me that there was a lot of games they would play. They would actually travel at night, and they actually would travel at night to get to their games, just so no one would see the color of their skin. So they would actually travel at night to get to their games. They'd get to their destination, play their games, and they would travel back home the same way. Some of the issues that they would encounter along the way, because of their color, they were traveling. Stopping off at restaurants to eat was a difficult task. And I say that kindly, saying it was a difficult task. It was almost impossible. Some of the things that they had to be concerned about when they were traveling on the road and they were hungry were making sure that if you went to the back door to get your food, that someone didn't put glass in it. And this is conversations that I had with both Ted Hartzell and also with Mr. Forney. You had to make sure that if you got soup beans and in the bottom of those beans someone hadn't did something else in it. Maybe someone had spit in it. But spit and glass and other things in your food were things they had to be concerned with. So it actually got to the point where when a lot of the guys were traveling to play the games at night, their wives and girlfriends would actually pack an enormous amount of food to get them there and back with no issue. But you bowl of beans in front of you, and then you put in your spoon and you find glass at the bottom. But anyway, these are just some of the things that they actually encountered. But to hear them tell their story, they had a wonderful time playing ball. There was a story, I was actually doing an interview with Columbus Ted Hartzell. We call him Uncle Ted. I called him Uncle Ted since I was a little girl. I didn't know when I interviewed him that he had known me since I was a little girl, because he knew my mom and my dad and the rest of my family. So I didn't know that he knew me until I knocked on his door and I introduced myself. He's like, I remember you when you were a little girl. I was like, get out. So once again, he invited us in, had something to drink, had something to eat, and he began to tell his story in his life and what it was like, with being an Elizabeth Bluegrass player. One of the things that was a highlight of their career was there is a team called the Ashland Blues, okay? The Elizabeth Bluegrass were an independent, barnstorming Negro League baseball team, which means they were not under contract. They were independent. They were actually playing against men who were under contract. They played against a group called the Ashland Blues, who were a part of the Negro Southern League, and the Ashland Blues were no joke. They were an amazing team. They were an amazing baseball team. And Uncle Ted always loves to tell the story about the time that the Elizabeth Bluegrass drove up to Asheville, played a game against the Ashland Blues, and beat them. He's like, they were just so mad. They could not believe that a little team from a little country town, as they call it, from Elizabeth, would actually come up and beat them. But that was actually a big deal. It was a big deal to have an independent barnstorming team beat a contracted team that's a part of the Southern Negro League. Bragging rights, definite bragging rights. So we actually have a lot of stories like that we have come across. We were very, very blessed to come across one photo in all the years, in all the 15 years of collecting history, photographs and everything. There's this one photo that I cherish. It's the only photo we have of one United States colored heavy artillery participant that's in the Civil War. He was Mr. David Brooks. I thought we would never be able to see a picture of any Civil War soldier that came out of the Cedar Grove community, but we did, and we did. We were actually able to get the original photo. The one thing that we ran into, we had a lot of people, once we had people's trust and they knew what we were going to do, and they knew who I was, they knew my mom, they knew my sisters, they knew where I came from, they knew me as a little girl growing up. It got to the point where people didn't want us to make copies of photographs. They wanted us to take the originals and keep them because they knew that they would be in good hands. And that kind of scared me, because I was thinking, oh my goodness, these photographs are older than me. So that was like an added responsibility that we actually had to take and keep them safe, and promise to do what we told them that we would do. So do we still want to do a book about the Cedar Grove community? We definitely have to. We have to share those photographs. We have to share those memories. If not, the things that we have collected and learned, if we don't get them out there in book or get them out there and publish them, no one is going to know the great Tennessee history that we have. The community history that came out of the Cedar Grove community, I love it because it's not just local history, it's also national history, and it's also Tennessee history. It's good, strong Tennessee history. And it's like I said before you start looking outside in other areas for your history, for your heroes, start within your house and then go outside within your community. Because if you're like me, I have spent over 15 years collecting history from my local community. I have kind of yet to like make it outside because there's just so much here. And and my mom once said, why would you want to go anywhere else and collect anyone else's history? I was like, you know what, you're right, I'm good here. So we were just very, very blessed and excited to be able to meet all the wonderful people that we have met. I was blessed to be able, like I said, to meet Harrison Taylor, a part of the Alf Taylor Governors of Tennessee people, and we would attend some of the occasional reunions because Harrison was just of the mindset that I was Taylor Ken. He was just of that mindset that I was Taylor Ken, and I was like, you know what? I've got you in my family, that might be a possibility. So there was actually a time when myself and Harrison and his wife Ramona got together and we were thinking maybe we need to do the ancestry DNA just to see if Augustus, he always called me Augustus, he never called me Jacey. We need to see if Augustus is actually Taylor Ken. So we were actually going to do the ancestry DNA, and we did not get a chance to do that because once again, life interrupts. We have these life events once again where, we have people becoming sick, we have people who had to leave out of the area, and we had so many things that became involved that we didn't get a chance to do that DNA ancestry testing, but I so wish that we had, because I so would love to know if I know that I'm Taylor King because I have Taylor on my father's side of the family, but I just wonder if I'm that Taylor King. So that's just a curiosity of mine. So that is something that the Cedar Grove community has been doing for over 15 years. Every now and then I do take a break. I'm not taking a break this time since Coach Presnell brought me out to actually honor the Bluegrays. We're actually trying to put everything together for a book. And the first book that I'd really like to do, I'd really like to make my first book to be like a compilation of all the stories that I actually wrote for the Johnson City Press. There was something, and there still is something called the Johnson City Press's Community Voices. I was one of maybe 8 of the original people that wrote and freelanced those stories for the Johnson City Press. Every one of my stories was all about local history. It was all about everything that happened here. So I really would like for our first book to be that, because if we were to get that first book together, that would give you a very strong insight, not only into the Cedar Grove community history, but it also shows you just how strong we are as Tennesseans, period, no matter who we are, where we come from. So that's something that I'd really like to do, and I'm actually working on. Something too that we found amazing was when Coach Preston, who was the coach of the Elizabethton High School baseball team, he actually contacted me because he wanted to honor the team by having his baseball players wear throwback jerseys and play a game and actually honor the Bluegrays, and that's what they did. So we actually had a night, and I was so excited because no one had ever done this before. I was made like honorary coach for a few moments. That was pretty exciting. So they actually honored the Bluegrays, the Elizabethton High School baseball team. They won their game. Coach Presnell put a lot of wins under his belts. There were fireworks at the end of the game, and it was just a wonderful time. And I love the fact that I was able to get all the family out. So whenever the family came out to this game to honor the Bluegrays, every person that threw out the first pitch was throwing a pitch out for one of these particular individuals. We actually had family members thrown out for Chick Forney. We had them thrown out for Mr. Landers, for Mr. Duffler. We had them thrown out for Ted Hartzell. We had the family coming out and throwing pitches in honor of every single picture of baseball player that we have there that's in that article. So that's what we've been doing for the past 15 years. So hopefully, I won't disappear again for like 6 or 7 years like before. And hopefully I can put this first book together. It's just going to be a compilation of all the stories that I wrote about. One of the things that was very important about the Cedar Grove community, you have to realize that when it was actually established in the late 1890s, there were no doctors around, right? So you had to depend on herbs and midwives and other people to attend to any kind of illnesses or any kind of sicknesses that you had. There was a man who would come through the community. He came through the community in a carriage and on a horse. And the horse had one eye. And the horse's name was One-Eyed Jack. And this was a white doctor. And during that time, white doctors did not offer medical care to people of color, to white people. That just didn't happen. But this particular doctor would come through the Cedar Grove community, and he came on a regular basis. And he came giving out medicine. He came and he attended to the sick. He came and he attended to the poor. And he never asked for a single dime. So I'd love to know who this man's relative is. But this man would come through often. He did have an association with the preachers in the local white churches. So I do know that the preachers probably told them, you know, Miss So-and-so is sick down on the corner of Wells Street. Could you go and tend to her and see what she needs? But whoever this doctor was, he came frequently and he came all the time. And the fact that someone would name a horse One-Eyed Jack is just amazing. But those are just some of the stories that you'll actually see and hear about in the Cedar Grove community. And there's so much more. There's so much more to talk about. I didn't go into a lot of in-depth material because there's just so much that I found out and so many things to talk about. But I do hope to do a book. I hope to do more than one book. I think I can at least have 3 under my belt. A couple of other things about the churches. This just came to me just now. A lot of people are curious about who actually established Philippi Baptist Church, and it was actually established by a slave by the name of Horace Lethbridge. He was someone who was enslaved. The person that owned him actually took him with him during the Civil War. I actually have a manuscript that Horace Lethbridge actually wrote. I have a copy of it, And he's talking about the things that he saw when the person that owned him took him with him during the Civil War. He's talking about the gunfire. He's talking about the men laying dead. He's talking about, he makes a reference to the Bonnie Blue being on fire. And I think this is so amazing. This is something too that I really want to share with the public, because the public needs to see the fact that a man that was enslaved and that founded a very historical church was actually there on the scene during the Civil War, and he wrote a manuscript, and you can read it and you can pretty much just see how he felt and how his heart must have been to see what he was doing to survive. He talks about the loudness of the war. Once again, like I said, he talks about the bodies, having to step over the bodies. He talks about horses falling. He talks about just so many different things. He talks about how young the men looked like that were laying on the ground that he saw as he was trying to get away from the person that owned them. So this is something too that I'd like to be able to get out into the public and share, because like I said, the Cedar Grove community has so much history. And it's just not African American history, it's history, period. Because a lot of people think that the Cedar Grove community was strictly an African American community, but it was not. If you go back and you pull up the census from like 1860 on, and you can actually, even though it was founded by enslaved freedmen and Civil War participants, if you look at the individuals, you can see that all throughout the community, you will have an African American family here, you'll have a white family here, you'll have an African American family here, and all of these people actually came together as one under the auspices of it being the Cedar Grove community, and the community thrived. Something too that a lot of people don't realize, there were a lot of businesses in the Cedar Grove community, and the Knights of the Thighs are actually responsible for getting some of these businesses up and going. There were several restaurants, believe it or not, in this small little place. There was a restaurant that was called the Dewdrop Inn. I thought that was kind of cute. And that particular restaurant was actually located on Southland Avenue. Another restaurant was actually called the Green Parrot, and that was another restaurant that was actually brought along by the Knights of the Thighs. You had grocery stores that were there. I do know that Mr. Paul Shannon in Richmond had the very first barber shop that was located on the corner from where Philippi Baptist Church is now. So there were a lot of businesses that was in the Cedar Grove community that a lot of people don't realize that it was a very flourishing community. It wasn't a very poor community. I know that sounds odd for people coming out of slavery, but it was very rich because people had businesses and they knew how to farm, and that was a time when neighbors took care of neighbors. And everyone wanted everyone else to be successful. So does anyone have any questions? Did I go over time? Am I good?
You're good.
Okay. Well, questions? Yes.
First, I want to thank you. That was just so interesting. And I'd love to see an exhibit, and I'd love to read the book. My two questions are, were they named the Blue Grays because they came from both the Union and the Confederate side of the Civil War?
You've got it. You have absolutely got it, yes. When talking to Uncle Ted Hartsall and Chief Forney, I had asked him, why would a group of men of color be called Blue Grays? And they said that it was a play on the Civil War. So you have hit the nail on the head. You're absolutely right. It was because of the Civil War, so that's why they were called Elizabeth and Blue Grays.
And how interesting that they were okay
with that
together as a united team.
Yeah.
And the second question, I missed where you said the shirt that you used to wear is. You said it was in Jonesboro.
It is actually in the Jonesboro Museum.
Okay,
Yes,
good.
it's there.
Good.
That is one of the two original shirts that was given to us from Brummett's Workshop. Yeah, so it's really old, and it doesn't look that old. It's really old, and I guess the quality was so good at that time, and the material is good, and the piping is good. And as I mentioned before, the only thing changed on the jerseys were the Brummett's new owners actually redid the lettering for me because the lettering was damaged. So that's the only thing that's been repaired on the shirt. So there's a small little hole that's actually, I think it's somewhere on the underneath side of the sleeve. But other than that, that shirt is in mint condition for it to be as old as it is. So
Thank you.
yes. Any more questions? Yes.
So, the group that were the Knights of the Thighs that founded the Cedar Grove community, you said that it was a combination of enslaved and free people, were they from East Tennessee prior to the Civil War? Or did they meet in the Civil War and then settle in this area, or do you know?
All those people that came in and settled came from different areas. Some of the people were already here. Some of these people, I actually forgot to mention that, thank you for that question. Some of those people, like my ancestors, actually came over from the Carolinas. They came through the Carolinas, but they made a stop in a small place called Shell Creek. That's where my mom and my family were actually originated from, was Shell Creek. So they came from the Carolinas, they came from Shell Creek. Some stopped in, not Mountain City, some stopped in Roan Mountain, and they made their way down through to Elizabethton because they either had family there or they had a place where they would be able to work. So you actually had people there that was from North Carolina, they were from Virginia, they were from our local area here. So you had people like from just different places that were actually coming together to actually, establish the Cedar Grove community.